I have written another article for New Eastern Outlook. This time it is about the conflict in Myanmar. Myanmar is located here in Southeast Asia, next to Thailand, where I am based. There's been a very destructive conflict fought there for years now, since 2021. And actually, this fighting has been going on for decades, since Myanmar gained its independence following the end of World War II. So let me begin. Overshadowed by ongoing fighting in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, as well as growing tensions between the US and China, the ongoing conflict in Myanmar nonetheless constitutes a critical component of what is a larger global conflict, depicted by Western governments and Western media as an isolated internal conflict between a military dictatorship and the forces of democracy. In actuality, the conflict represents decades of Anglo-American attempts to reassert Western control over the former British colony. And as I will explain later on in the article, the reason they seek to do this is because Myanmar shares a border with China, and there's a much wider strategy of encircling and containing China. So controlling or destabilizing Myanmar contributes toward a policy of encircling and containing China itself. Much of the fighting is taking place between the central government and armed ethnic groups that had at one point been a part of the British Empire's occupation force, utilized by the US and UK during World War II against the Japanese, and used ever since to disrupt Myanmar's ambitions for independence and self-determination. Alongside these armed ethnic groups, the US has constructed a parallel political establishment, eventually installed into power through compromised elections in 2020. Now, the US didn't rig the elections in Myanmar, but they compromised the media space, the information space, the education system. They poured millions and millions of dollars into the opposition's political parties and their media organizations, and it was so lopsided in their favor. Anyone else running stood no chance. No one else had nearly as many resources to invest in the election, so they won. So it wasn't rigging the elections by tampering with ballots, but it was rigging it in a different way. It was compromising it through foreign interference, American interference. In 2021, Myanmar's military removed from power the US client regime headed by Aung San Suu Kyi, advised by literal British and Australian citizens, and supported by a collection of US government-funded and backed political organizations, media platforms, and educational institutions, both within and beyond Myanmar's borders. And by that, I mainly mean here in Thailand. There is a huge number of US government-funded organizations involved in sedition, even terrorism, inside of Myanmar. And they're based here, out of reach of Myanmar's government, and with essentially the protection of the US government, because the US government will tell the Thai government, don't touch them, or we will spread this into your country as well. The US has been semi-covertly backing attempts by the ousted regime to retake power through armed violence ever since. So from 2021 onward, there were protests, which from the very beginning started violently. There were armed groups involved, and just as the US did in Libya and Syria in 2011 onward, they just started pumping weapons and other forms of support into the country to continuously escalate this conflict until it is now very serious, very deadly, very destructive. So let's talk about psychological warfare as a substitute for effective conventional warfare. The militants that the US is backing have a wide range of problems, and so they depend heavily on public relations stunts. So let's get into a little bit of that. And it's very, very similar to what we had seen from 2011 onward in Syria and what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. The fighting has continued mainly along Myanmar's frontiers, regions that have hosted US-backed armed ethnic groups pursuing separatism for decades, but also at times, and to a lesser degree, inside some of Myanmar's urban centers. While the US-backed opposition has failed to oust the central government or even significantly threaten it militarily, Western governments and the Western media have attempted to pass off temporary and eventually reversed gains as an impending opposition victory. They're trying to build psychological momentum here. Opposition strikes on central government and military facilities, including in the nation's capital, have also been passed off as growing opposition competence, as if they're developing these new deadly capabilities and that they're on the path toward victory. So there's this article from The Diplomat that I cite. Myanmar's revolution has entered a new, more complicated phase as the military junta's losses mount. The resistance faces growing challenges of cohesion and coordination. So maybe the military's losses aren't as great as reported. Again, there a lot of similarities between the West coverage in Syria, if you remember that, Ukraine right now, and also Myanmar, if you're following it. This is what the article says. So they're talking about the capital city of Myanmar. It has come under unprecedented attack. In early April, a dozen resistance drones breached the city's defenses and attacked military facilities across the sprawling city. Days later, opposition forces fired several rocket attacks, which hit a junta airbase next to the international airport. Zakaria Musa, professor at the National War College in Washington, D.C., who focuses on politics and security in Southeast Asia, and he's also heavily involved in advocating U.S. interference all across Southeast Asia, said that the attack on the capital will have dented the junta's morale. The drone and rocket attacks have caused little physical damage or casualties, but they have caused psychological damage. It is their fortress capital and the physical manifestation of the bubble that the generals live in, he said. Attacks like this are meant to show that there is no place where the generals are safe, except if the drones and the rockets didn't hurt anybody or damage anything seriously, then the generals are safe. The very fact that Myanmar's US-backed opposition must rely on symbolic gestures indicates its military deficiencies. A similar strategy is being used by US NATO-backed Ukraine. Missile and drone strikes are carried out against targets deep in Russian territory, primarily to generate headlines for a proxy war. Washington, London, and Brussels are otherwise decisively losing. It is a strategy also used throughout the US proxy war in Syria from 2011 onward, with attempts to create psychological momentum designed to panic Damascus and its allies into breaking and fleeing. It too failed. So now they're trying it in Myanmar. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Mostly it doesn't. U.S. support for the opposition is full spectrum. Political, media, and militant groups receive huge sums of money and support from the U.S. government through the National Endowment for Democracy and United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And the way that works is, if you look at where these opposition groups are based, these armed ethnic groups, it's all along the borders of Myanmar, while the central government controls the middle of Myanmar. And the government has been able to fight and defeat these armed groups, but they're not able to move into these areas. The country is just too big. The military simply doesn't have the capability to be everywhere at the same time. What they need to do is develop the country. And this is what almost always ends these type of divide and conquer tactics. But they don't have the ability to do so. They've been caught up in this type of fighting for decades. They have not had the ability, the opportunity to develop their country and develop these rural, far-flung regions. What USAID does is they come in and they ensure that these regions are not dependent on the central government. They give them just enough resources to be independent of the central government. They're entirely dependent on US handouts. They never give them the capabilities to be self-sufficient in and of themselves. They want to keep them on the hook and use them as proxies as part of this divide and conquer strategy they are using against Myanmar. Weapons and military training are provided by Americans and Europeans working with so-called humanitarian aid and advocacy groups like the Free Burma Rangers. And I've talked about the Free Burma Rangers in the past. I'll put a link to a video that I did about them. It's headed by a U.S. Army veteran revealed to be in direct contact with the U.S. consulate in Chiang Mai in neighboring Thailand. And this is according to U.S. diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks. So I have a bunch of them listed in the video description below, right here. All of these events taking place in Myanmar, the U.S. consulate in Chiang Mai, Thailand, or the embassy in Bangkok, they become aware of it because they are in direct contact with the Free Burma Rangers. Here's another one. Snapshot of Northern Karen State provides little hope. Chiang Mai, this is them talking with the Free Burma Rangers right here. The links to all of these will be in the video description, and you could read them in their entirety. And if you watch videos of the Free Burma Rangers in Myanmar, you will see that they are providing military training. They're going on armed patrol with these rebels, these armed ethnic groups, and they swear that they're not bringing in weapons, but it's the only logical explanation as to how these people living in the middle of the jungle are getting modern war weapons. How else are they getting? They're getting everything else through these groups, through the NED, through USAID. Someone is bringing in the weapons. Just like the US has done absolutely everywhere else, it is backing these type of armed opposition groups. Despite the flow of resources into Myanmar's opposition, the nature of post-colonial Myanmar constitutes vicious ethnic, religious, and political divides, meaning opposition forces are just as likely to fight with one another as they are the central government. And this is a reoccurring theme among US proxies, doesn't matter what country they're in. The type of people who agree to work with the United States against their own nation's best interests are people who are unreliable, incompetent, and almost prone to self-destruction. This is a problem for the US itself. It cannot find reliable, capable partners in any of these targeted countries. It's just the nature of what they're trying to do to these countries that attracts the wrong type of people to actually achieve it. Let's talk a little bit more about the nature of the fighting itself. At the moment, the fighting remains stagnant despite headline-grabbing developments like the opposition's seizure of the town of Myawaddy along the Myanmar-Thailand border. The New York Times, let's look at both of these articles here. There's this one, April 12th, 2024. Myanmar rebels take key trading town, but counteroffensive looms. So at least the New York Times was honest enough to admit that. As I remember when that first happened, this was not that long ago, April 12th this year. Many people showed me this article, showed me this news development, and was asking about, does this mean that the US-backed opposition is winning in Myanmar? And it said, in a week or two, the Myanmar military is almost certainly going to take that city back. And if not in a week or two, eventually it will transfer back to government control. This has been going on for decades, and there's no indication, at least not that I can see, that anything has fundamentally changed. So sure enough, not even 2 weeks later, the New York Times posted this article. Myanmar's junta recaptures town that was a significant gain for rebels. Well, it wasn't really that significant, it turns out. The seesawing nature of the fighting is depicted by the Western media and Western officials and analysts they interview as a sea change in the opposition's favor. However, Myanmar's post-colonial history has consisted of decades of such fighting, including the changing of hands of various towns and cities along the edges of the central government's control. Just as the opposition is using drones and rockets to symbolically strike at key government and military facilities in the capital because they lack the military means to actually threaten them, it is taking vulnerable frontier towns and cities where government forces are spread out thinnest precisely because of its inability to fight and defeat Myanmar's forces in pitched battles. Let's talk about why the US is ultimately interfering in Myanmar, dividing it and destroying it. While ultimately the US seeks to reinstall its client regime into power in Myanmar, preventing peace and development in Myanmar is a secondary objective. So if they can't get their client regime back into power, burning the country to the ground is a good second option for them. The Southeast Asian country serves as an important partner for China's Belt and Road Initiative, which includes a port and hydrocarbons pipeline running the length of the country to China's Kunming region. This allows China to move hydrocarbons from the Middle East to China without transiting the Strait of Malacca and other waters that could potentially be blockaded by the US's growing military presence in the Asia-Pacific region. I've talked about this very often. But first, let's just take a look at this infrastructure. So we can see there's ports, there's pipelines, there's an oil pipeline, a gas pipeline, there's rail infrastructure, and you can see it leads up through Myanmar into China, into Kunming. And all of this is well short of the Strait of Malacca, which when ships are traveling to China, they have to go down this peninsula, Myanmar, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, around Singapore, and then onward to China. So having this port and these pipelines, that allows China to send hydrocarbons without having to pass the strait and all of that extra travel at sea. China's Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure has been repeatedly targeted by US-backed militancy several times since 2021, as have Chinese businesses operating across Myanmar. So let's just take a look at a couple of those headlines. And I've covered these many times before. Associated Press, this is 2021, March, attacks on Chinese-run factories in Myanmar vex Beijing, because the US-backed opposition is literally paid, funded, backed, indoctrinated to hate China. And so this is, the US already admits it's waging a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. It is also waging a proxy war against China, where it is backing armed groups who destroy Chinese infrastructure, Chinese-owned factories, and also kill Chinese citizens abroad. Say in Pakistan, I cover that very often, when US-backed terrorists in southwest Pakistan kill Chinese engineers and the Pakistani security forces trying to protect them. That is the US behind all of that. That is the US waging a deadly, destructive proxy war against China. If the US could, it would fly B-52 bombers and just carpet bomb that pipeline that I just showed you a map of. But they can't, so they do the next best thing in their mind, which is to arm terrorists to do it for them. It gives them a degree of separation, some plausible deniability, and it still achieves their ultimate objective, which is to stunt China's economic, political, diplomatic, military growth, to stunt it, encircle it, contain it, and eventually divide, overthrow the government, divide and destroy China, and subjugate it, which is what it tries to do all around the world. So we're becoming quite familiar with how the US is attempting to do this regarding Russia. It's very important to understand how the US is also trying to do this regarding China. So there's this from AP. There was this. This was also, this was 2022. China-backed pipeline facility damaged in Myanmar resistance attack. If you're using armed violence to achieve a political objective, not to defend yourself, but to achieve a political objective, you're not a resistance fighter. You are a terrorist by definition. Here's another one from 2022. Chin resistance kills 2 Myanmar junta soldiers guarding Chinese pipelines. So this is something that has been going on. And the Irrawaddy, by the way, is one of the many media organizations funded by the US government in or about Myanmar. Almost the entirety of any English language media you see regarding Myanmar is funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy, the Irrawaddy chief among them. Far from a battle between democracy and dictatorship, the conflict instead is one of a much wider strategy of encirclement and containment by the United States of China, stretching back to the end of World War II. The US seeks to either control or destabilize nations along China's periphery, either creating US client regimes hostile to Beijing or security crises along China's border, preventing trade development and economic growth of China itself. Let's talk about where all of this is heading. Final conclusion of Myanmar's current conflict is far from clear. While similar fighting has ebbed and flowed for decades, always ending in the central government's favor. There are several factors that will determine whether or not this cycle will continue. While Myanmar's military possesses resources and capabilities beyond the reach of US-backed militants it is fighting, the ability and will to use them effectively is entirely up to Myanmar's central political and military leadership. In other words, they have many advantages. Are they going to continue using them effectively or not? That is up to them. That is a factor that is going to determine the outcome of this conflict. In terms of the opposition, among the many weaknesses of US-backed armed groups is their inability to work together with other ethnic and political fronts the US is sponsoring. Just as was the case in Syria, while at times the central government was overwhelmed by large numbers of militant operations across the country, the inability to coordinate them allowed government forces to defeat in detail each organization involved before moving on to the next. A similar strategy appears to be in use by Myanmar's military. Government forces withdraw where they are stretched, then return in force when resources can be redeployed effectively against opposition deployments. That the opposition is essentially engaged in hit-and-run operations, exploiting gaps in the central government's force deployment, demonstrates fundamental weakness requiring asymmetrical strategy and tactics. Unless the opposition, and that doesn't mean that it couldn't win or end in success, but they have been doing this forever and it hasn't. That's all I'm trying to say here. Of course, much depends on the wider global conflict the fighting in Myanmar fits into. With the US losing its proxy war in Ukraine, its influence eroding in the Middle East, and the disparity between a rising China and a waning United States continues to grow, Washington's ability to sustain support for opposition groups within and beyond Myanmar's borders may come into question. Should that happen, the cycle of deadly, destructive fighting, debilitating Myanmar's development as a nation for decades could begin coming to an end. The above-mentioned diplomat article would note the inability of opposition groups to work together. It cites Ang Tu Nguyen, director of the US government-affiliated Institute for Strategy and Policy Myanmar, based in Chiang Mai, Thailand. All right, let me address what this organization is and its US government affiliation. Of course, you go to the website, it's not going to admit at all who funds them. And when they're not admitting who funds them at all, it's almost certainly the US government. But let's go beyond that. Let's go to the NED's official website, Journalism on the Front Lines of Freedom. And so this is some event that the NED put together. And who is there? Min Zin, Executive Director, Institute of Strategy and Policy, Myanmar. So he's at NED events. He's also part of the US government's US Institute of Peace Myanmar Study Group. He's down here, Min Zin. And then on their website, if you look up Min Zin, his profile, it admits that he works for Freedom House, which is a subsidiary of the National Endowment for Democracy. So they could try to cover it up all they want on their website. This is a U.S. government-affiliated organization. Institute for Strategy and Policy Myanmar. But despite the U.S. government affiliation and funding, this is what they say. Nonetheless, this is what they say. Ang Tu Nguyen says that the coming phase of the war could be tricky and that more junta defeats could paradoxically divide the country further. He says the National Unity Government, that is the fake parallel government that the U.S. Recognizes, that is where Aung San Suu Kyi and all of her followers fled to. Well, not Aung San Suu Kyi, she's being detained, but all of her political party, her government, they all fled to beyond Myanmar's borders, and they've made this government in exile called the NUG, the National Unity Government. It remains popular in Myanmar among the general population, but some of the ethnic groups are moving away from its leadership. And I should say, a lot of them were never interested in the NUG in the first place. A lot of them are intent on just having their own little fiefdom, independent of absolutely everyone. They want to forge their own path and pursue their own political agendas, which is basically what I just said. The problem is a common agenda against the common enemy and building an alliance to fight together, he said. But the ethnic armed organizations can't do that, and the National Unity Government can't lead that. So that's quite a predicament, but the US doesn't actually care. They would love it for Myanmar to be ruled by a single client regime they control, but if it's divided and destroyed in a failed state, that is okay with them also. The only way the United States can rule the entire world is if everyone else is divided and destroyed, basically. That is how empire has ruled all throughout history. Divide and conquer. So that was from the Diplomat article. Let me continue reading. This means that even if the US-backed opposition was successful in ousting the central government and military, Myanmar itself would only descend further into chaos. The central government stands the only real chance of unifying the nation and moving it forward together with the rest of a rising Asia, but only if US-sponsored subversion and militancy ends or is successfully overcome. Just as is the case with Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere in the Asia-Pacific region, Myanmar's fighting is among an array of conflicts presented to the general public as spontaneous, unrelated crises the US must respond to, when in reality, it is the US primarily driving them all, and all in order to preserve its ability to determine the outcome of regions around the world, rather than the people actually living in these regions themselves. The outcome of Myanmar's ongoing fighting depends largely on the rest of the world's ongoing efforts to either aid and abet US hegemony or confront, oppose, and ultimately dismantle it. Until then, Myanmar's fate remains suspended in perpetual armed conflict. And that is the end of my article. And I would also like to add that it's not just Myanmar. This fighting in Myanmar affects the rest of Southeast Asia. It affects China. Instability in one part of the region affects the rest of the region. It drags the whole rest of the region down. When you are surrounded by functioning, organized, constructive neighbors, you yourself benefit. And if you're surrounded by dysfunctional, borderline failed states, that is also going to affect you. It's going to affect you in terms of people fleeing over the border, seeking refuge in your country. It is economic opportunities that go unrealized. It is infrastructure that could be built and beneficial to the entire region that right now cannot be built because of the security situation. And of course, the instability the US is deliberately creating in Myanmar is something that they actually want to spread to the rest of Southeast Asia. Unfortunately, a lot of governments in the region either support US policy toward Myanmar, depending on which government, which party. Also, the US-backed opposition party here in Thailand obviously supports the US position on Myanmar, but some of them act as if they're indifferent and they just allow the US to do whatever they want, including inside their country, including here in Thailand right now. The US government, the organizations that it is using to divide and destroy Myanmar, they are based here in Thailand. The government just seems indifferent to it all. It allows it to take place. And when you allow that to take place in a neighboring country, eventually it's going to affect you as well. We have seen this happen so many times in the Middle East. We're seeing it happen right now in Europe. An attack on one nation's sovereignty is an attack or at least a threat to all nations' sovereignty. And it's only a matter of time before that danger targets you. Eventually, it will target you. So it's good to raise awareness of this. If more amongst the general public are aware of this, maybe they can put pressure on their governments. Whatever country you're in, you can put pressure on your government to do something about this, to put an end to it, to at least not allow your country to host US-backed subversion, even terrorism, armed militancy and terrorism that is hurting a neighbor and that is almost certainly going to blow back and affect your country as well. I will continue keeping an eye on this conflict, the wider situation here in the Asia-Pacific region. Of course, we still have these conflicts in the Middle East and of course the conflict in Eastern Europe, Ukraine, the US proxy war against Russia and Ukraine. I will keep an eye on all of them. Till then, if you thought this video was useful, please like and share. Think about subscribing. It's free to do. It helps the channel grow. Check the video description below for other places you can find and follow my work. Please check for all of the links to all of the articles and resources that I referenced in this video, as well as for ways you can help support my work. I do not monetize my YouTube channel. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. If ads pop up, feel free to skip them. They're not doing me any good. If you do want to help support my work, please do so through Buy Me a Coffee and also Patreon. To everyone who has been helping out, whether it's a one-time donation, a donation month to month, if you have no extra resources available and you're just sharing my work with others, getting the word out there, that is all greatly appreciated. That is what makes this work possible. So thank you, and thank you for watching.